What if I told you that Africa has finally spoken with one voice at the United Nations, and that voice has shaken the world? In New York, African leaders rose to condemn what many are now calling the Gaza Genocide. From South Africa to Senegal, from Angola to Zambia, the message was clear: enough is enough. But here's the twist. This global stand is putting new pressure on Zambia's president, Hakainde Hichilema. His every move at the UN is being watched not just by the world, but also by the Lungu family back home. Why is Zambia suddenly caught in the middle of a global showdown? And how could this moment change the balance of power between HH, the Lungu family, and the nation's future? Stay with us, because what happened at the UN may reshape Zambia's politics forever. Breaking news: Africa has spoken at the United Nations. Leaders from across the continent have united to call the Gaza Genocide unacceptable, and the shockwaves are reaching Zambia. In this special report, we uncover why African leaders are taking a bold stand at the UN, the role of Zambia, President Hakainde Hichilema, HH, and what this means for his leadership, how the Lungu family is being drawn into the international spotlight, the pressure building on African governments from global powers. Stay with us till the end, because this UN showdown could reshape Africa's political future, and Zambia is right at the center of it. The speech that shook the UN at the United Nations. Speeches are often predictable, scripted, diplomatic, and quickly forgotten. But this time was different. When African leaders took the stage to speak about Gaza, the atmosphere shifted. The usual polite applause gave way to something heavier, a silence filled with tension. From South Africa to Senegal, from Angola to Zambia, voices rose with urgency. They did not speak cautiously, nor did they hide behind neutral phrases. They called Gaza what many in the West would not dare to: a genocide. South Africa's representatives led the charge, demanding accountability and invoking the memory of apartheid, reminding the world that they had lived through oppression and knew its smell. Senegal's delegation spoke of Africa's duty to stand with the oppressed, invoking solidarity that stretched across continents. Angola's leaders echoed those words, describing Gaza as not just a Palestinian tragedy, but a moral test for humanity itself. Then came Zambia. For President Hakainde Hichilema, the stakes were personal. At home, he faced criticism, suspicion, and pressure. At the UN, he had a chance to rise above domestic battles, to cast himself as a defender of justice on the global stage. His words drew applause abroad, but back home, they raised questions. Was this true conviction or political theater? For a brief moment, the divisions of Africa, linguistic, political, historical, seemed to fade. The continent's voice rang out clear, united, and unafraid. The message was simple: Gaza mattered, and Africa would no longer remain silent. But unity is never without consequence. In the corridors of the UN, whispers spread of Western frustration. Diplomats scribbled notes, some in support, others in alarm. Could Africa's boldness shift the balance, or would it invite retaliation? The speech that shook the UN was more than a statement. It was a declaration that Africa, long sidelined in global politics, would speak not just for itself, but for justice everywhere. And yet, as the applause faded and the leaders left the podium, one question lingered in the chamber. Was this the beginning of Africa's rise as a moral superpower, or just a fleeting moment of defiance? HH under the spotlight. When President Hakainde Hichilema walked into the United Nations chamber, he carried more than a speech. He carried Zambia's fragile reputation, his own political survival, and the expectations of a continent searching for bold leadership. For many Zambians, HH's appearance at the UN was more than symbolic. At home, his government faced growing criticism, from accusations of economic mismanagement to the never-ending controversies surrounding the Lungu family. For his critics, the stage in New York offered him an escape. For his supporters, it was a chance to prove that Zambia could still punch above its weight in global affairs. As he took the podium, his tone was measured, deliberate. He spoke of human dignity, justice, and the responsibility of nations to act against oppression. He framed Gaza not as a distant tragedy, but as a mirror, a reminder of Africa's own painful past, when silence from the world prolonged suffering. The reaction was swift. Applause broke out across the chamber. Yet beyond the clapping hands, cameras zoomed in on his face, searching for sincerity. Was this a man speaking from conviction, or a politician seizing an opportunity? Back home in Lusaka, the debate was immediate. Some praised him as courageous, finally giving Zambia a voice in global justice. Others accused him of playing politics, using Gaza as a shield to distract from domestic failures. On social media, Zambians argued fiercely, was HH standing for truth or simply standing for himself? For the international community, his words positioned Zambia as a moral voice, but also a vulnerable one. Aligning too strongly against Western allies risked financial repercussions. Yet, wavering risked alienating African partners who demanded unity. It was a delicate balancing act, and HH knew it. Every sentence, every phrase was designed to resonate both abroad and at home. By the time he left the stage, one thing was clear. Hichilema had not just addressed the UN, he had placed himself at the center of a storm. And now the question remains, did HH elevate Zambia onto the global stage, or did he step into a spotlight too bright for him to survive? South Africa's bold gamble at the United Nations, one voice rang louder than the rest. South Africa did not just condemn the violence in Gaza, it went further. It called for investigations, sanctions, and accountability at the highest levels. This was not cautious diplomacy, it was a gamble. Pretoria invoked its own history, drawing sharp parallels between apartheid and the suffering of Palestinians. For many in the hall, the words carried undeniable weight. South Africa had lived the pain of isolation, oppression, and brutality. To hear its leaders speak was not just rhetoric, it was testimony. But beyond the moral language lay strategy. South Africa has long sought to reclaim its role as Africa's leading voice in global affairs. By taking a bold stand, it risked Western backlash, but also positioned itself as the continent's conscience. For the ruling ANC, struggling with domestic challenges, corruption scandals, power shortages, economic decline, Gaza offered an opportunity to unite its base and revive its fading revolutionary image. The reaction was polarizing. Some nations applauded South Africa's courage, seeing it as a moral compass in a world too afraid to act. Others bristled, dismissing the comparisons to apartheid as inflammatory, even dangerous. In Western capitals, diplomats whispered about consequences, trade pressures, diplomatic freezes, even questions about South Africa's place in global partnerships. Back home, the speech was hailed by many as a moment of pride. Crowds in Johannesburg and Cape Town gathered, waving flags, praising their government for speaking truth to power. Yet critics warned that in chasing moral victories abroad, Pretoria risked worsening its economic troubles at home. It was a gamble, moral, political, and economic. If successful, South Africa could emerge as the leader of a new African unity. If it failed, it could find itself isolated, punished, and weakened on the global stage. But one thing was certain. In that UN chamber, South Africa had reminded the world of its history. And in doing so, it forced a question no one could ignore. If apartheid was once condemned, how can the world remain silent now? The ghost of Edgar Lungu, when African leaders gathered at the UN to speak on Gaza, a name absent from the room, still lingered in the air. Edgar Chagwa Lungu. Though gone, Zambia's former president casts a long shadow over the nation's politics. His legacy of power, controversy, and unfinished battles continues to shape how Zambia responds to international crises like Gaza. For many, Lungu embodied a different era. A leader who forged ties with China, leaned on regional alliances, and often placed Zambia's sovereignty above global pressures. To his supporters, he was a defender of African independence, unafraid of the West. To his critics, he was an opportunist who weakened institutions while strengthening his inner circle. Now, in his absence, President Hakainde Hichilema carries Zambia's voice to the global stage. But every word HH delivers is measured against the memory of Lungu. The divisions back home between those who saw Lungu as a hero and those who denounced him as a villain echo into today's diplomacy. The Gaza debate in particular has stirred this ghost. Some Zambians ask, what would Lungu have said? Would he have stood firmly with South Africa in calling out genocide? Or would he have played the cautious diplomat, seeking balance between East and West? And then there are the rumors, whispers of Lungu's family, their disputes over his burial, their rejection of Zambia as no longer home. These domestic struggles intertwine with Zambia's global image, painting a picture of a nation still haunted by unresolved questions about leadership, loyalty, and identity. At the UN, when Zambia speaks, it does so not just with the voice of HH, but with the weight of its history. A history shaped in part by a man no longer alive, yet still present in every political calculation. Edgar Lungu's ghost is not about superstition. It is about memory, legacy, and the power of unfinished stories. And until Zambia reconciles with his shadow, every international stage will feel his presence. The hidden pressure on HH at the United Nations, President Hakainde Hichilema stood before the world, calm, composed, and deliberate. His words on Gaza carried the authority of a head of state, but behind the scenes, the pressures weighing on him told a more complex story. For HH, this was not just another speech. It was a balancing act between international expectations and domestic realities. On one side, he faces a Zambian public deeply moved by images of suffering in Gaza, a population that demands moral clarity. On the other side, he must manage relationships with powerful global players, the US, the EU, and financial institutions whose support is vital for Zambia's fragile economy. Every sentence at the UN carried risks. Speak too strongly against Israel, and Zambia could strain relations with Western allies. Speak too softly, and HH risks being seen at home as weak, even complicit. But the pressure is not only external. Inside Zambia, opposition voices, many loyal to Edgar Lungu's legacy, are waiting for any misstep. To them, Gaza is not just a foreign crisis, it is a chance to question HH's leadership. Was he bold enough? Did he betray African unity? Or was he merely playing the role of a Western ally? Then comes the personal dimension. HH has built his brand on being a reformer, a man of integrity, discipline, and vision. But reformers often walk a lonely road. His critics accuse him of caring more about foreign approval than domestic struggle, pointing to Zambia's economic challenges, high unemployment, and rising living costs. For them, Gaza is a test of where his true loyalties lie. The hidden pressure is immense. To many, HH must not only lead Zambia, he must represent the conscience of Africa. Yet he must also protect his nation's fragile recovery, maintain delicate diplomatic ties, and shield himself from political rivals at home. At the UN, what the world saw was a speech. But for HH, it was a survival act, one that will define not only his image abroad, but also his ability to hold power at home. When Africa spoke as one, the United Nations chamber had grown used to divided voices from Africa. Different nations, different strategies, different loyalties. But on Gaza, something remarkable happened. For one brief moment, Africa spoke with unity. South Africa, Senegal, Angola, Namibia, and Zambia, nations often separated by politics, language, and history, came together to declare one thing: the killings in Gaza could no longer be ignored. This was not cautious diplomacy. It was a collective cry against silence. The power of that unity was striking. In a hall where the world's great powers often drown out smaller nations, Africa's voice rose above the noise. Delegates whispered about the unusual solidarity. Journalists noted that rarely had the continent stood so firmly, so visibly, together on a global crisis. But unity is never simple. Behind the speeches were months of quiet coordination. Diplomats worked late nights, exchanging drafts, aligning language, and navigating the fault lines of African politics. Some leaders feared retaliation from Western allies. Others worried about losing aid. Yet still they stood. The symbolism was powerful. For decades, Africa was portrayed as a divided continent, too weak to shape global debates. But in that moment, Africa proved it could lead, not just follow. The Gaza crisis had given the continent something it rarely found: common ground. Back home, the reaction was electric. Citizens across African capitals took pride in their leaders' defiance. Protesters carried Palestinian flags alongside their own national banners, chanting that Africa had finally spoken with one voice. But the unity carried a warning too. Could this moment last? Or was it simply a flash of solidarity, soon to be tested by the pressures of economics, geopolitics, and national interests? For now, history records that Africa, often dismissed at the world stage, stood tall together. And in doing so, it sent a message far beyond Gaza. Africa is no longer content to remain a spectator in global crises. It demands to be heard. The West reacts when Africa raised its voice at the UN. The world listened, but not everyone applauded. In Washington, London, Brussels, and Paris, the reactions were swift and often uneasy. For Western powers, the Gaza debate was already a diplomatic minefield. Their own positions, balancing alliances with Israel while facing pressure from domestic voters and international law, were fragile. Africa's bold stand only added fuel to the fire. Publicly, many Western officials spoke carefully. They praised Africa's commitment to peace, while avoiding direct acknowledgement of the word that had shaken the chamber: genocide. Privately, though, diplomats expressed frustration. Some accused African nations of oversimplifying the conflict. Others warned that Africa risked damaging its credibility by drawing parallels with apartheid. But the political stakes went far deeper. Western governments have invested billions in African economies through trade, loans, and aid. A united Africa questioning Western silence threatened not just reputations, but influence. For decades, the West shaped narratives on global conflicts. Now, Africa was seizing the microphone. The media response reflected the divide. In Africa, newspapers hailed the UN speeches as historic. In Europe and America, coverage was more cautious, sometimes critical. Some headlines suggested African leaders were grandstanding, while others admitted Africa had struck a nerve the West preferred to avoid. Behind closed doors, the lobbying began. African diplomats reported quiet pressure from Western counterparts, warnings about trade deals, aid packages, and diplomatic ties. The message was clear: boldness had consequences. Yet Africa's leaders seemed unmoved. In fact, some saw the backlash as proof they had finally broken through. If the West was uncomfortable, it meant Africa's words had power. But the story is not yet over. The West's reaction revealed not just discomfort, but fear. Fear of losing moral authority, fear of losing influence, and fear that Africa, long sidelined, was now shaping global opinion. And so, as the UN debates continued, one truth emerged. The world had changed. Africa was no longer whispering at the margins. It was challenging the very powers that once defined its place. A continent's defining moment for decades, Africa has been described as a continent of potential, always rising, yet always waiting. But at the United Nations, during the Gaza debates, something shifted. For the first time in a generation, Africa was not just reacting to global events, it was defining them. This was more than speeches. It was a statement of identity. By standing together and calling out genocide, Africa signaled that it would no longer be silent on questions of justice. The echoes of colonial history, apartheid, and centuries of exploitation gave weight to its words. When African leaders spoke, the chamber did not hear abstract diplomacy. It heard lived experience. The symbolism was profound. A continent once dismissed as divided and dependent had shown unity and moral clarity in the face of one of the world's most polarizing crises. For ordinary Africans watching from Nairobi, Lusaka, Dakar, and Johannesburg, pride replaced cynicism. At last, many said, "Our leaders are speaking for us." But history teaches us that defining moments are fragile. Will this unity survive the pressures of global politics? Will Africa's stand at the UN be remembered as the beginning of a new era, or just a fleeting moment of defiance? That depends not only on speeches, but on actions. If Africa continues to speak with one voice, on Gaza, on trade, on climate, on debt, it could transform its place in the world. It could shift from being a stage for other struggles to becoming an actor in its own right. But if unity fractures under pressure, this moment may fade into memory, another lost opportunity in a long history of near rises. For now, the world has taken notice. Africa's defining moment has been written into the story of Gaza, into the story of the UN, and into the story of a continent that is no longer content to remain silent. This was not just about Gaza, it was about Africa itself. And perhaps years from now, history will look back at this moment and say, this was the day Africa found its voice.